the Tellier establishment. They would go there every evening around 11 o'clock, as simply as they might go to a cafe. The gathering consisted of 6 or 8 people, always the same set. They were not at all debauches, but respectable men, tradesmen, and young men about town. They would drink a glass of chartreuse and engage in light flirtation with the girls, or talk seriously with the madam, whom they all treated with respect. Then, around midnight, they would disperse and head home. The younger men would sometimes stay the night. The establishment was a small, yellow-painted house standing on a street corner behind the church of Saint Etienne. From its windows, one could see the dock where ships were unloaded, the vast salt marsh known as the Reservoir, and beyond it, the Côte de la Vierge with its ancient, weathered chapel. The madam, who came from a respectable peasant family in the yurt apartment, had taken up this profession just as she might have become a milliner or a seamstress. The prejudice against prostitution, so powerful and deep-rooted in cities, does not exist in the Normandy countryside. The peasant says it's a good trade and sends his daughter to run a brothel just as he would send her to manage a girls' boarding school. Moreover, this establishment had come to her by inheritance from an old uncle to whom it had previously belonged. She and her husband, who had until then been running in near I've Todd, immediately sold it, realizing that the business in Fécamp would be far more profitable. And so, one fine morning, they arrived to take over the management of a business that had already begun to decline due to the owner's absence. They were good-natured people and were immediately liked by both the staff of the establishment and the neighbors. 2 years later, the husband died of stroke. His new profession condemned him to a life of idleness and inactivity. He grew very fat, and his excessive good health proved fatal. After his death, the widow became the object of futile advances from all the regular patrons of the house. It was said that her virtue was absolute. Even her own girls had never managed to detect any flaw in it. She was tall, plump, and pleasant-looking. Her face, pale from the perpetual twilight of the always shuttered house, had a sheen as if coated with a layer of varnish. A narrow fringe of false, fluffy, and curly hair framed her forehead, giving her a youthful appearance that contrasted with her buxom maturity. Invariably cheerful and open-faced, she was fond of a joke, but always with a shade of reserve that she had not yet lost in her new occupation. Coarse language always shocked her, and when some ill-bred fellow referred to the establishment she ran by its proper name, she would become indignant and angry. In short, she had a sensitive soul, and though she treated her girls as friends, she was still fond of saying that she and they were not cut from the same cloth. Occasionally during the week, she would hire a carriage and drive out to the country with a part of her troupe. They would frolic on the grass by the banks of a stream that runs through the Valmont Valley. These were the outings of boarders who had broken free. They ran about like mad women, played like children, and reveled like recluses intoxicated by the open air. Seated on the grass, they would eat cold sausage and wash it down with cider, returning home at dusk with a feeling of delightful weariness and sweet contentment. In the carriage on the way back, the girls would hug and kiss the madam as if she were a kind, good-natured, and indulgent mother who spoiled them. The house had 2 entrances. On the very corner, a sort of tavern for the common folk and sailors opened in the evenings. 2 of the young ladies, entrusted with the specialized commerce of this part of the establishment, were reserved exclusively for its clientele. With the help of a servant named Frederick, a short, beardless blond fellow, strong as an ox, they served bottles of wine and mugs of beer onto wobbly marble-top tables, and then, embracing the customers, and sitting on their laps, would coax them into buying drinks. The other three ladies, there were 5 in all, constituted a kind of aristocracy and were kept for the company that gathered on the second floor, except for occasions when they were needed downstairs and the upper floor was empty. The Salon of Jupiter, where the local bourgeois gathered, was papered in blue and adorned with a large painting depicting Leda stretched out beneath the swan. This room was reached by a winding staircase which ended on the street side in a narrow, unassuming door. Above this door, a small lantern burned all night behind a grill, like those still lit in some towns at the feet of Madonna statuettes set into wall niches. The building, damp and old, smelled faintly of mildew. At times, a whiff of eau de cologne would drift through the corridors, and at others, when the door downstairs was opened, the coarse shouts of the men carousing below would reverberate through the house like peals of thunder, causing the gentleman on the second floor to grimace with unease and distaste. The madam, who was on familiar terms with her regular clients, never left the salon and took a lively interest in the town gossip they brought with them. Her serious conversation provided a contrast to the disjointed chatter of the 3 women and served as a kind of respite from the playful banter of the portly gentleman, who indulged every evening in a respectable and harmless debauch, which consisted of drinking a glass of liqueur in the company of public women. The 3 ladies of the second floor were named Fernande, Raphael, and Rosa Ross. As the staff was small, it was necessary for each of them to be a kind of archetype, an embodiment of a certain feminine ideal, so that every customer might find here, at least approximately, something corresponding to his particular taste. Fernande represented the archetype of the statuesque blonde. She was tall, almost corpulent, with the soft flesh of a country girl whose freckles she could never quite get rid of. Her thin, short hair, a pale and colorless flaxen, was so sparse that one could see the scalp beneath, resembling combed-out tufts of carded wool. Raphael, a drab from Seaport, a native of Marseille, thin, with prominent, rouged cheekbones, played the inevitable role of the Jewish beauty. Her black hair, pomaded with beef marrow, curled in ringlets at her temples. Her eyes might have been beautiful were it not for the cataract on the right one. Her aquiline nose descended over a protruding jaw, where 2 upper false teeth stood out sharply in their whiteness against the lower teeth, which had darkened with time like old wood. Rosa Ross, a veritable ball of a woman, all belly on tiny little legs, sang from morning till night in a raucous voice, alternating between bawdy and sentimental couplets, or told endless and pointless stories, ceasing to speak only to eat, and ceasing to eat only to speak. Nimble as a squirrel despite her fat and her short legs, she was perpetually in motion. Her laugh, a cascade of piercing shrieks, rang out incessantly here and there, in the rooms, in the attic, in the cafe, downstairs, everywhere, and without any apparent reason. The 2 women of the ground floor were Louise, nicknamed the Chick, and Flora, dubbed Swayback, because she limped slightly. The first was always got up as a figure of liberty, with a tricolored sash, while the second was a fantastical Spanish dancer, with copper sequins that jingled in her carrot-colored hair with every uneven step she took. Both of them resembled scullery, maids dressed up for a carnival. They were like any other women of the people, neither worse nor better. They were genuine tavern wenches, and in the port they were known by the nickname the 2 Pumps. Among these 5 women reigned a jealous peace, rarely disturbed thanks to the madam's wise, calming influence and her inexhaustible good nature. This establishment, the only one of its kind in the small town, enjoyed a thriving patronage. The madam had managed to give it such a respectable tone. She was so amiable, so attentive to everyone, and so renowned for her kind heart, that she was treated with a sort of respect. The regulars vied to please her and felt triumphant when one of them managed to earn even a modicum of her attention. When they happened to meet during the day on business, they would typically say, "Until this evening," where, just as one says, "See you at the cafe after dinner, all right?" In a word, the Tellier establishment was a place of genuine delight, and it was a rare occurrence for anyone to miss the daily gathering. But then, one evening in late May, Monsieur Poulin, the timber merchant and former mayor, who had arrived first, found the door locked. The lantern behind its grill was unlit. Not a sound came from the house. It seemed completely lifeless. Monsieur Poulin knocked, first softly, then louder, but no one answered. Then he set off slowly back down the street, and in the market square he encountered Monsieur Duvert, the ship owner, who was heading for the same place. They returned together, but with no more success. Suddenly, a terrific noise broke out nearby. Having gone around the house, they saw a crowd of English and French sailors pounding with their fists on the closed shutters of the ground-floor cafe. The two bourgeois immediately made themselves scarce, afraid of being compromised, but a faint puss stopped them. It was Monsieur Tourneveau, the fish curer. He had recognized his friends and called out to them. They told him what was the matter, and this distressed him greatly, for, being a married man and father of a family who was kept on a tight leash at home, he could only come on Saturdays, securitatis causa, as he used to say, alluding to a certain sanitary police measure, the periodic repetition of which his friend Dr. Board had informed him of. This very evening was his night, and thus he was deprived of his pleasure for a whole week. The three men made a wide detour, reached the quay, and on the way met another habitué, young Monsieur Philippe, the banker's son, and also the tax collector, Monsieur Pimpus. They all returned together via the Rue aux Juifs to make one last attempt. But the infuriated sailors were laying a veritable siege to the house, hurling stones at it and howling wildly. So the 5 second-floor clients promptly turned about and resumed their wandering through the streets. They were joined by Monsieur Dupuis, an insurance agent, and then by Monsieur Vasse, the judge of the commercial court, and so began their long promenade, which first led them to the breakwater. There they sat down in a row on the granite parapet and watched the dazzling white, fiery flashes of foam sparkle on the crests of the waves, only to vanish instantly into the gloom. The monotonous roar of the surf, crashing tirelessly against the rocks, echoed through the night along the entire winding coastline. The melancholy group spent some time there, until Monsieur Tourneveau remarked, "Not terribly cheerful, is it?" "I should say not," replied Monsieur Pimpus, and the company slowly trudged on. They walked the entire length of the Rue sous le Bois, which runs along the cliff top above the sea, then returned via the wooden footbridge across the reservoir, crossed the railway tracks, and found themselves once more in the market square. There a violent argument suddenly flared up between the tax collector, Monsieur Pimpus, and the fish curer, Monsieur Tourneveau, concerning a type of mushroom which one of them claimed to have found in the neighborhood. Worn out by boredom, they were both irritable, and the quarrel might have come to blows had the others not intervened. Fuming, Monsieur Pimpus walked away, but new altercations immediately erupted. The former mayor, Monsieur Poulin, locked horns with the insurance agent, Monsieur Dupuis, arguing about the tax collector's salary and his potential additional earnings. Insults flew from both sides, when suddenly a terrible uproar broke out. The crowd of sailors, tired of waiting in vain outside the locked house, came pouring into the square. They marched in pairs, holding hands, forming a long, noisy column, and were yelling at the top of their lungs. The group of bourgeois hastily took refuge in the doorway of a nearby house, and the shrieking mob swept on towards the abbey. For a long time, their shouts could be heard fading into the distance, like a receding thunderstorm, before silence finally fell once more. Monsieur Paulin and Monsieur Dupuis, furious with each other, parted without even saying goodbye. The remaining four set off again and, as if by instinct, found their way back to the Tellier establishment. It remained just as silent and impenetrable as before. A drunkard was stubbornly tapping on the cafe window, muttering the servant Frederick's name under his breath. Getting no response, he sat down on the doorstep, resolved to wait. The bourgeois were about to disperse when a new crowd of sailors from the port appeared at the end of the street. The French were bellowing the Marseillaise, and the English were roaring Rule, Britannia. In response, the mob surged towards the house, but then the enraged mass swerved and headed for the quay, where a fight broke out. An Englishman had his arm broken, and a Frenchman had his nose split open. The drunkard, still sitting by the door, had now begun to weep, the maudlin, helpless sobbing of the inebriated or of wronged children. One by one, the bourgeois drifted away. The town, agitated by the noise, gradually settled into silence. Only occasionally would a murmur of voices still flare up somewhere, fading away in the distance. Only the fish curer, Monsieur Tourneveau, continued to pace nearby. He was devastated at the prospect of having to wait until next Saturday. He still hoped for some chance occurrence, could not believe what was happening, and was indignant with the police for allowing a public service, which was under its supervision, to be closed so suddenly. He went back to the house, scrutinized its walls, and noticed a posted notice under the eaves. He struck a wax match and read the large, uneven letters, closed due to First Communion. Then he left, realizing all hope was lost. The drunkard was now asleep, stretched out full length before the inhospitable door. The next day, all the regulars found a reason to walk down that street, with business papers tucked under their arms for propriety's sake, and each of them, with a sidelong glance, read that mysterious announcement, closed due to First Communion. The madam had a brother, Joseph, a carpenter by trade, who lived in their native village of Verville in the Eure department. When she was still keeping the inn at Yvetot, she had stood as godmother to her brother's daughter, a girl named Constance Rivet. The madam's own maiden name was also Rivet. Knowing his sister was doing well for herself, Joseph kept in touch, though they met infrequently. Each was busy with their own affairs, and the distance between them was considerable. Now the girl was about to turn 12, and this year she was to make her first communion. The carpenter decided to use the occasion to strengthen ties with his sister and wrote her a letter expressing his hope that she would not refuse to come. "The old folks are gone," he wrote, "and surely you won't deny your goddaughter on such a day." She agreed. For his part, Joseph hoped that by being polite and attentive, he might perhaps persuade his sister to make a will in his daughter's favor, as the madam had no children of her own. His sister's profession caused him no anxiety, and indeed, no one in his circle knew anything about her real business. They merely said, "Madame Tellier lives in Fécamp," which allowed them to assume she lived on an income. and the journey from Fécamp to Verville was a good 20 leagues. For a peasant, such an overland journey was a greater undertaking than crossing the ocean was for a cultured man. The inhabitants of Verville rarely traveled beyond Rouen, and nothing drew the people of Fécamp to a village of 500 houses, lost amid the plains of another department. In short, nobody knew anything there. But as the day of the communion approached, the madam found herself in a difficult predicament. She had no assistant, and the thought of leaving the establishment, even for a single day, was unthinkable. Quarrels between the ladies of the upper and lower floors would inevitably flare up, and Frederick would certainly get drunk, and when drunk, he was capable of causing all sorts of trouble. In the end, she decided to take the entire staff with her, except for the servant, to whom she granted leave until the day after tomorrow. Joseph raised no objection and promised to arrange lodging for the whole company. And so, on Saturday morning, the madam and her girls set off in a second-class carriage on the 8 o'clock express. They had the compartment to themselves as far as Buseville and chattered without cease, like a flock of magpies. But at that station, a married couple got into their compartment. The husband, a wizened old peasant, wore an old-fashioned top hat with furrowed, reddish nap, and was clad in a blue smock with a finely pleated collar and wide sleeves, gathered at the wrists and adorned with white embroidery. In one hand he held a huge green umbrella, in the other a large basket from which the heads of 3 ducks peered out in confusion. His wife, stiff and stern in her rustic attire, had a face with a nose as sharp as a beak, which gave her the look of a hen. She sat down opposite her husband and remained motionless, embarrassed to find herself in such brilliant company. And indeed, the carriage was suddenly ablaze with bright colors. The madam, dressed entirely in blue silk, had draped over her shoulders a dazzlingly red shawl of imitation French cashmere. Fernande was poured into a Scottish patterned dress. Its bodice, which her companions had barely managed to fasten, hoisted her pendulous breasts into a sort of twin-domed structure that constantly quivered and shimmered under the strained fabric. Raphael, in a hat adorned with a bird's nest and feathers, flaunted a lilac dress embroidered with gold spangles. The outfit had a faintly oriental flair that accentuated her Jewish features. Rosa Ross, in a pink skirt with wide flounces, resembled nothing so much as an overgrown little girl or a corpulent dwarf. As for the 2 pumps, they looked as if they had dressed themselves in old curtains with the large figured patterns from the time of the Bourbon Restoration. As soon as the ladies were no longer alone in their compartment, they assumed a dignified air and began to speak of elevated matters, as if striving to make a respectable impression. But at Bolbec, a gentleman with blonde side whiskers, adorned with rings, and a gold watch chain on his waistcoat, got in. After carefully placing several oilcloth-wrapped parcels in the luggage net above, he bowed, smiled with the air of a good-natured joker, and asked in a familiar tone, "Transferring to a new garrison, are we?" The question discomfited all the women. Finally, recovering herself and wishing to defend the honor of her corps, the madam retorted coldly, "You would do well to be more polite." He spread his hands and apologized. "Forgive me, I meant to say a convent." The madam could find no reply. Deeming the correction sufficient, she merely gave a dignified nod and compressed her lips tightly. The gentleman sat down between Rosa Ross and the old peasant and began winking at the 3 ducks whose heads were protruding from the large basket. Then, noticing that everyone's attention was fixed on him, he started tickling the birds under their beaks and, as if performing a comic skit, spoke to them. "So, you've left your little puddle, have you? Quack, quack, quack. To get acquainted with the roasting spit, quack, quack, quack." The poor creatures strained their necks, trying to avoid his touch, and writhed in their wicker prison, until all 3 at once let out desperate cries. Quack, quack, quack. The women burst into peals of laughter. They leaned over, nudging each other with their elbows to get a better view. The ducks aroused their frantic curiosity, and the gentleman redoubled his antics, his witticisms, and his flirtatiousness. Rosa could resist no longer. She leaned across her neighbor's knees and planted a kiss on the beaks of all 3 ducks. Immediately, the others wanted to do the same. The gentleman seated the ladies on his knees, bounced them, pinched them, and suddenly began addressing them with a familiar too. The peasants, meanwhile, sat as if turned to stone. Even more stunned than their fowl, they stared wide-eyed, as if possessed, not daring to move a muscle. Their old, wrinkled faces showed not a trace of amusement, not a single smile. It turned out the gentleman was a commercial traveler. As a joke, he offered the ladies some braces and, grabbing one of his parcels, unwrapped it. Inside, however, were not braces but garters. They were of every kind: blue, pink, scarlet, mauve, lilac, crimson, all with metal clasps in the form of gilt cupids embracing one another. The young ladies shrieked with delight and began examining them with that intense concentration which comes over any woman handling an article of finery. They exchanged glances, whispered comments, and whispered replies to one another. The madam herself was running a covetous eye over an orange pear, wide, substantial, the sort of garters befitting a madam. The traveler, biding his time, smiled to himself. "Well now, my kittens," he said, "it's time to try them on." This provoked a storm of exclamations, and the ladies instantly clamped their skirts between their knees, as if fearing an assault. He waited calmly for his moment, and finally added in a faintly indifferent tone, "Well, if you don't want to, I'll pack them up again, though I would make a gift of a pair to any lady who dares to try them on." The ladies sat up straight, maintaining their dignity, and remained silent. But the 2 pumps looked so crestfallen that he repeated his offer. Flora Swayback, in particular, was visibly in torment. Her desire was all too plain. "Come now, my dear, be brave," he urged. "Look, these lilac ones. They would match your dress perfectly." Finally, plucking up her courage, she hitched her skirt to reveal a thick, dairymaid's leg encased in a coarse, badly stretched stocking. The gentleman bent down, fastened the garter below the knee, then above it, lightly tickling the girl as he did so, which made her squeal and shudder. When he had finished, he handed her the lilac pear and asked with a smile, "Who's next, then?" Everyone shouted at once, "I am! I am!" The gentleman started with Rosa La Rosse, who exposed a shapeless, rounded object, a veritable sausage in place of a leg, as Raphael liked to say. Fernanda received a flattering compliment from the traveler. He expressed delight at her mighty columns. The slender legs of the Jewish beauty, however, made a much lesser impression. Louise the chick, as a joke, draped her skirt over the gentleman's head, and the madam had to intervene to put a stop to such an indecent prank. Finally, the madam herself extended her leg, full, muscular, and sturdy in the Norman fashion. The traveler, genuinely astonished and admiring, doffed his hat with gallantry, like a true French knight saluting a pair of exemplary calves. The old peasants, petrified with astonishment, stared sideways, their eyes wide like chickens. Then the gentleman with the blonde side whiskers, half rising, suddenly shouted right in their faces, "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" This provoked a fresh storm of merriment. The peasant couple got off at Maudeville with their basket, their ducks, and their umbrella. As she left, the old woman grumbled to her husband, "Tarts, that's what they are. Off to that cursed Paris, the whole lot of them." The jocular commercial traveler alighted at Rouen. By the end, he had grown so forward that the madam was forced to check him sharply, adding with a schoolmistress's air, "Let that be a lesson to you. One shouldn't strike up a conversation with just anyone." At Oisel, the ladies had to change trains, and at the next station they were met by Monsieur Joseph Rivet. He had arrived with a large wagon, hitched to a white horse and fitted with chairs. The carpenter greeted the ladies with hearty kisses and helped them to their seats. 3 of the friends installed themselves on the chairs at the back. Raphael, the madam, and her brother took the seats in front. There was no room left for Rosa, so she perched directly on the lap of the ample Fernanda. Then the vehicle set off. But no sooner had the little horse broken into a trot than the wagon began to jolt so violently that the chairs danced and shook. The women were tossed up, to the right and to the left. They jerked about like marionettes, made grimaces of fright, and uttered cries of horror, suddenly cut short by a fresh jolt. Each clung convulsively to the sides of the wagon. Their hats slid onto the backs of their necks, onto their noses, or onto their shoulders, while the white horse kept on running, its neck outstretched and its rat-like hairless tail with which it occasionally swiped its own hindquarters. Joseph Rivet, with one foot on the shaft and the other leg tucked under him, held the reins with his elbows held high, and from his throat there escaped from time to time a sort of clucking sound, which made the horse prick up its ears and quicken its pace. Green fields stretched out along both sides of the road. The flowering rape plants spread a golden-yellow tablecloth, whose sharp, sweetish scent was carried far and wide by the wind. In the tall rye, the bright blue heads of cornflowers were visible. The women wanted to pick some, but Rivet would not permit a stop. A little further on, whole patches seemed drenched in blood, where the red of wild poppies flamed in the sun. And across this riot of color, the white horse drew the wagon, which itself looked like a motley bouquet of flowers. From time to time the carriage disappeared behind the trees of a farmstead, then reappeared beyond a small green wood, carrying its radiant cargo of women under the sun, past the yellow and green crops sprinkled with red and blue spots. The clock was striking noon when the wagon drew up at the carpenter's gate. The women were exhausted and famished, for they had not eaten a morsel since morning. Madame Rivet ran out to meet them, helped them alight, and embraced each one as soon as her feet touched the ground. She was particularly effusive with her sister-in-law, kissing her repeatedly in an effort to win her favor. They lunched right in the workshop, where the workbenches had been cleared away for the next day's celebration. A golden omelet, followed by fried, chitterling sausages, washed down with plenty of fresh, sparkling cider, soon restored the ladies' cheerful spirits. Rivet had a glass of cider himself, and his wife bustled about the table. She did the cooking in the kitchen, served the dishes, cleared the plates, and each time whispered in her guests' ears, "There now, my dears, have you had enough to eat?" Piles of boards leaning against the walls and heaps of wood shavings swept into the corners filled the air with the rich fragrance of freshly planed wood, that resinous breath of the carpenter's workshop which penetrates straight to the lungs and lingers there, like a memory of the living forest. The guests expressed a desire to see the little girl, but she was at church and was not due to return until evening. So the whole company went out for a stroll. The village was small. A wide road ran through it, lined with a dozen or so houses, those of the butcher, the grocer, the carpenter, the tavern keeper, the shoemaker, and the baker. At the end of the street stood the church, surrounded by a narrow cemetery. Four immense lime trees, planted in front of its facade, shaded it so completely with their foliage that only a shadow of the building remained. Constructed of dressed flint, it had no particular architectural style. A simple belfry, roofed with gray slate, rose above it, and beyond the church, the fields stretched out again, dotted here and there with clumps of trees sheltering farmsteads. Although in his working clothes, Joseph Rivet ceremoniously offered his arm to his sister and escorted her down the street with great dignity. His wife, dazzled by Raphael's dress spangled with gold, placed herself beside her and Fernande. The plump Rosa trotted along behind with Louise the chick and Flora Swayback, who was limping from weariness and could barely keep on her feet. The inhabitants came to their doorways. Children stopped their games. A head in a cotton bonnet peered out from behind a curtain. A half-blind old woman on crutches even crossed herself, as if before a religious procession. No one remained indifferent to this parade. Every pair of eyes followed the elegant ladies from Paris, who had come from so far away for the first communion of the carpenter's daughter. This attention noticeably enhanced Joseph Rivet's prestige in the eyes of his fellow villagers. From the church came the sound of children singing. A prayer was rising to the heavens, chanted in thin, piercing little voices. But the madam strictly forbade anyone from going inside, so as not to disturb these little angels. After a walk through the fields, during which Joseph enumerated in detail all the local farms, their land revenues and livestock, he led his guests back to the house and set about arranging their sleeping quarters. Places were, of course, insufficient, and the women had to be put up two to a room. Rivet himself was to sleep that night in the workshop on the wood shavings. His wife shared her bed with her sister-in-law. Fernande and Raphael were installed in the adjoining room. Louise and Flora were given a mattress on the kitchen floor. As for Rosa, she was allotted a tiny, dark closet at the top of the stairs, right next to the lumber room where the little communicant had been put for the night. When the girl returned home, she was immediately showered with kisses. Each of the women was eager to caress her. They felt that familiar craving for tenderness, the same one that had made them kiss the ducks in the railway carriage. The child was passed from lap to lap. Her fair hair was stroked affectionately. She was pressed against bosoms with sudden fervor and gentleness. And she, docile, still imbued with the solemnity of the service, patiently endured all these effusive displays of affection, as if she were already accustomed to them. It had been a long day, so they retired to bed soon after supper. Over the little village descended the profound silence of the fields, a calm, almost solemn stillness that seemed to rise to the very stars. For the young women, accustomed to the noisy evenings of a brothel, this rural quiet was unsettling and even disturbing. A shiver ran through them, not from cold, but from a sense of solitude emanating directly from their troubled hearts. Once in bed, lying two together, they clung tightly to one another, as if seeking protection from this deep, sovereign peace of the earth. But Rosa Ross, left alone in her dark cubbyhole and unaccustomed to sleeping without a companion, felt a vague, uneasiness. She tossed and turned, unable to close her eyes. Suddenly, from the other side of the thin wooden partition by her head, she heard faint sobs, as if a child were crying. Frightened, Rosa called out in a whisper. A broken, little voice answered her. It was the little girl. Accustomed to sleeping in her mother's room, she was now trembling with fear, all alone in the narrow closet. Rosa, filled with delight, rose quietly and, careful not to wake the others, went to the child. She settled the little girl in her own warm bed, held her close to her bosom, covering her with kisses and rocking her as if she were an infant, lavishing upon her exaggerated displays of tenderness. Gradually soothed, she herself fell asleep, and until morning, the head of the little communicant rested on the bare breast of the woman of easy virtue. By 5 o'clock in the morning, before the service began, the lively pealing of the small church bell woke the ladies, who usually slept until noon, making up for their night's labors. The village was already astir with its early life. The peasants rose with the dawn, and the peasant women bustled hurriedly from house to house, chattering animatedly as they carefully carried short muslin dresses, starched to the stiffness of cardboard, or enormous wax candles, tied in the middle with a silk ribbon bearing a golden fringe and a knob to hold. The sun was already high, shining in a deep blue sky, which still retained a faint rosy tint near the horizon, like a fading trace of dawn. Families of chickens were strutting outside the hen houses, and now and then the crow of a black rooster with a glossy neck and crimson comb would ring out, only to be taken up by others from nearby farms. Carts from the surrounding hamlets rolled in, and stately Norman women, dressed in sober dark gowns and with neckerchiefs crossed over the breast and fastened with antique silver brooches, alighted at the church doors. The men, some in new frock coats, others in old green tailcoats, had nonetheless thrown their inevitable blue smocks over the top, from which the long skirts of their coats protruded. Once the horses had been led to the stables, a double line of rustic conveyances, carts, cabriolets, charabancs, tilburys, wagons of every shape and vintage, some with their noses drooping to the ground, others with their shafts pointing to the sky, stretched along the entire main road. Meanwhile, in Joseph Rivet's house, the bustle was like that of a beehive. The ladies, half dressed in their bodices and petticoats, their hair loose and lackluster, were bustling around the little girl, helping her to dress. She stood motionless on the table, while Madame Tellier directed the movements of her troop. They washed the child, combed her, arranged her hair, dressed her, and with a multitude of pins they fastened the folds of her dress, nipped in the waist, which was too loose, and generally arranged her attire for the proper solemn effect. When she was ready, the little martyr was told to sit down and not move, and the women then hurried to make themselves ready for the ceremony. The bell began to ring again. Its thin, irregular peal rose up and was lost in the blue sky, like a feeble voice dissolving in the boundless firmament. The communicants came out of the houses and headed towards the school building, which also housed the town hall, situated at one end of the village, while the church was at the other. Their parents, in their finery and looking self-conscious, walked beside them with awkward movements, their bodies more accustomed to being bent over hard labor. The girls were lost in clouds of white tulle, resembling whipped cream, while the boys, looking like junior waiters from a cafe, strode importantly in their black trousers and with their hair meticulously slicked down. It was a particular honor for a family when a child was accompanied by a large number of relatives. The Rivet household's celebration became a veritable event. The entire Tellier regiment, headed by the Madame, marched behind Constance. The father gave his arm to his sister. The mother walked beside Raphael. Fernande walked with Rosa, and the two Pomps kept together. Their procession resembled a general staff in full dress uniform. The whole village was astounded. At the school, the boys formed up under the command of their teacher, a dignified and imposing man, and the girls under the wide cornet of the sister, a nun. After a hymn was sung, the children set off for the church. The boys led the way, walking in 2 rows between the lines of vehicles. The girls followed in the same order. And behind them, ceding the place of honor to the visiting ladies, came the townsfolk, 3 by 3 on each side, their bright dresses shimmering like the variegated sparks of a festive firework. When the procession entered the church, the congregation nearly lost its composure. People craned their necks to see, jostled one another, and whispered. The devout women exclaimed almost aloud, marveling at the ladies' attire, which was as bright and striking as the vestments of the choir. The mayor, showing particular deference, yielded his pew to them, the first on the right, near the choir. Madame Tellier sat down next to her sister-in-law, with Fernande and Raphael. On the second pew were Rosa Ross, the 2 Pomps, and Joseph Rivet himself. The choir was filled with kneeling children, the girls on one side, the boys on the other. In their hands they held long candles, which resembled lances tilted at various angles. Before the lectern stood 3 men, intoning the psalms in powerful voices. They endlessly drew out the syllables of the solemn Latin words, sustaining an interminable "n," accompanied by the booming note of the serpent, which burst from its wide, brass mouth like the roar of a beast. A thin, childish voice answered them. From time to time, a priest in a square biretta rose from his seat, muttered something inaudible, and sat down again, while the choristers continued their chant, their eyes fixed on the pages of the large Gregorian chant book resting on a stand shaped like a wooden eagle with outstretched wings. Suddenly, a complete silence fell. All present sank to their knees, and the officiating clergy appeared, a venerable, white-haired old man. He carried the chalice in his left hand and bent his head over it. 2 altar boys in red robes preceded him, and behind him came the procession of choristers, their boots tapping rhythmically on the stone floor as they arranged themselves on either side of the choir. A bell tinkled in the reverent silence. The service had begun. The priest moved slowly before the golden tabernacle, genuflected, and chanted the introductory prayers in his aged, quavering voice. As soon as he fell silent, the choristers and the serpent took up the chant again, and the men in the congregation joined in, but more softly and humbly, with fitting modesty. And suddenly, the solemn Kyrie eleison surged towards the vaulted ceiling, bursting from the chests and hearts of the entire assembly. The stonework trembled from this thunderous chorus, shaking loose motes of dust and fragments of rotten wood. The sun's rays, striking the slate roof, turned the small church into a blaze of heat. The anticipation and presentiment of a great mystery clutched at the children's hearts and stirred the breasts of their mothers. The priest paused for a moment, then ascended to the altar once more. Bearing his silvery head, he began the sacred rite with trembling hands. Stretching out his arms to the flock, he pronounced, "Orate, fratres, pray, brethren." The people gave themselves over to prayer with all their hearts. The old priest whispered the secret words. The tinkling of the bell became incessant. The congregation, prostrate, called out to the Lord. The children trembled, overwhelmed with emotion. At that moment, Rosa, her head bowed in her hands, suddenly remembered her mother, the church in her native village, her own first communion. It seemed to her that she was once again a little girl in a white dress, and her heart constricted. Tears began to roll quietly down her cheeks. At first, she wept almost imperceptibly, but then the memories overwhelmed her with renewed force. Her breath caught, her chest heaved, and a heavy sob escaped her. Pressing a handkerchief to her eyes, her nose, and her mouth, she tried in vain to stifle it. But soon, her two neighbors, Louise and Flora, were also sobbing. Bowing their heads, they too were remembering a distant past and could not hold back their tears. The weeping proved contagious. The madam felt her own eyelids grow moist. She turned to her sister-in-law and saw that their entire pew was now in tears. Meanwhile, the priest was completing the mystery, transforming the bread into the body of the Lord. The children, prostrate on the floor, were seized by a sacred ecstasy. Women throughout the church, moved by the children's state and overwhelmed by the sight of the important ladies weeping so profusely, also pressed their checkered handkerchiefs to their faces, stifling their sobs. Just as a spark ignites a dry stubble field, the sobs of Rosa and her companions swept through the entire crowd. Men, women, the old, young lads in new smocks, all were weeping unrestrainedly. It seemed as though something supernatural, the breath of an unseen, all-powerful being, was hovering over their heads. A sharp tap sounded from the choir. The nun had rapped her book, giving the signal for communion. The children, trembling with pious awe, approached the holy table. The entire row of children knelt. The old curate, holding the gilded ciborium, passed before them, offering with 2 fingers the sacred host, the body of Christ, the redemption of the world. The children convulsively parted their lips, turned pale, and squeezed their eyes shut. Their faces twitched with tension, and a long linen cloth spread beneath their chins trembled like a living stream of water. And suddenly, a wave of collective rapture swept through the church. A murmur of sobs, stifled cries, a veritable whirlwind capable of bending entire forests to the ground. The priest stood motionless, the host in his hand, stunned, whispering to himself, "It is the Lord, he is here among us. He is manifesting his presence, descending to his people in answer to my prayer." And, seized by this revelation, he stammered disjointed prayers that burst from the depths of his soul. He finished distributing the communion with such intensity of faith that his knees grew weak. After drinking from the chalice the blood of the Lord, he sank into a fervent prayer of thanksgiving. The crowd behind him gradually grew calmer. The choristers in their majestic white surplices rose again and began to sing, but their voices were softer now, trembling with the emotion they had witnessed. Even the serpent seemed hoarse, as if it too had shared in the universal weeping. The priest, raising his hands, called for silence. Passing between the rows of children lost in blissful ecstasy, he approached the very rail of the choir. The congregation was settling back into their seats, noisily moving chairs. Many were blowing their noses loudly. But, upon seeing the curate, they fell silent, and he began to speak in a low, trembling, husky voice. "My brothers, my sisters, my children, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. You have given me the greatest joy of my life today. I felt the Lord descend to my call. He was here among us and filled your souls so fully that you shed tears. I am the oldest priest in the diocese, but today I'm also the happiest. A miracle has taken place here, a true, great, ineffable miracle. The very moment Jesus Christ entered the hearts of these children for the first time, the Holy Spirit, the heavenly dove, the breath of God Himself, descended upon you, seized you, and made you bend like reeds before a sudden wind. He caught his breath and continued more loudly, addressing the pews where the carpenter's guests were sitting. And I thank you in particular, my dear sisters, you who have come from afar. Your presence, your evident faith, and your fervent piety have been an example to all. You have shown my flock a living lesson. Your heartfelt emotion has warmed every heart. Perhaps without you, this day would not have been marked by such a clear seal of divinity. Sometimes the presence of one chosen soul is enough for the Lord to descend upon an entire flock. His voice broke. He concluded, "May grace be with you." Amen. Thereupon, he ascended to the altar to finish the service. Now everyone was in a hurry to leave. Even the children, exhausted from the long strain, could not sit still. They were tormented by hunger. The parents, not waiting for the final gospel, hurried home to put the finishing touches to the festive meal. A crush developed at the door, a noisy jostling, a babble of voices with their sing-song Norman accent. The whole village lined the street, and as the children appeared, each family rushed towards its own. The women from the Rivet household surrounded Constance, swept her up, and covered her with kisses. Rosa would not let her goddaughter out of her embrace. Finally, she took the girl by one hand. Madame Tellier held the other, while Raphael and Fernande lifted the long muslin skirt so it wouldn't touch the dust. Louise and Flora, with Madame Rivet, brought up the rear of the procession. And Constance, collected, filled with the consciousness that God Himself now dwelt within her breast, walked home escorted by her guard of honor. The feast was laid out in the carpentry workshop on long boards resting on trestles. The doors were thrown wide open, and the general merriment that had taken hold of the whole village poured inside. A celebration was underway in every house. Through the windows, one could see tables set for the meal, peasants in their Sunday best, and hear the sound of ringing voices and laughter. The men sat in their waistcoats, drinking strong cider, and at the center of every table shone the faces of two children, sometimes two girls, sometimes two boys, uniting whole families around them. At times, beneath the languid midday sun, a charabanc would pass through the village. The old horse would jog along at an uneven trot, and the man in the blue smock driving it would cast an envious glance at all this merrymaking, so openly displayed. In the carpenter's house, the mood was more restrained. The morning's emotion had not yet subsided. Rivet alone was in high spirits and drank without measure. Madame Tellier kept glancing at her watch. To avoid losing 2 days in a row, they had to catch the 3:55 train, which would get them to Fécamp that evening. The carpenter tried to distract her and persuade her to stay until morning, but the madam would not yield. In business matters, she permitted no laxity. As soon as they had drunk their coffee, she ordered her flock to get ready and said to her brother, "You go and harness the horse." Then she busied herself with the final preparations. When she came downstairs, her sister-in-law was waiting to speak to her about the girl. A long, inconclusive conversation ensued. The peasant woman was being crafty, feigning tenderness, while Madame Tellier, holding the girl on her knee, avoided any commitments and confined herself to vague promises. She would see to things. There was time enough. They would see each other again. Meanwhile, the carriage still hadn't arrived, and the girls hadn't come down. From upstairs came loud laughter, scuffling, shouts, and clapping. The carpenter's wife went to the stable to see if he had finished harnessing, and the madam went upstairs. Rivet, quite drunk, half undressed, was vainly trying to overpower Rosa, who was helpless with laughter. The two pumps, shocked by this scene after the morning ceremony, were holding the carpenter by his arms, trying to calm him, while Raphael and Fernande were egging him on, doubled over with laughter, holding their sides and shrieking at each clumsy lunge the drunkard made. Furious, purple-faced, and enraged, he was trying to shake off the two women clinging to him, tugging with all his might at Rosa's skirt and muttering thickly, "So you won't have it, you slut?" The madam indignantly rushed forward, seized her brother by the shoulders, and thrust him out of the door with such force that he banged against the opposite wall. A minute later, he could be heard in the yard, splashing water over his head, and when he reappeared, seated on the cart, he was perfectly sober. They set off in the same order as the day before. The little white horse set off again at its brisk, jolting trot. The high spirits, subdued during the meal, now broke out again under the scorching sun. This time the girls were amused by the jolting of the cart, shoved their neighbors' chairs, and burst into loud laughter, their mood already lifted by Rivet's unsuccessful attempts. A blinding light flooded the fields and dazzled their eyes. The wheels raised two columns of dust, which lingered for a long time in their wake on the high road. Fernande, who loved music, begged Rosa to sing. She boldly struck up the fat curate of Meudon, but the madam told her to be quiet, deeming the song unsuitable for such a day. "Better sing something by Berenger," she added. After a moment's hesitation, Rosa chose Grandmama and began singing it in her cracked voice. My grandmother, on her saint's day, took a drop of wine, so, they say, sighed, and shook her head with a knowing air. Ah, what hearts I captured beyond compare! My shapely leg I mourn, my hand so soft and fine, I mourn the days long gone. That will not again be mine. A chorus of young ladies, directed by the madam herself, took up the refrain. My shapely leg I mourn, my hand so soft and fine, I mourn the days long gone. That will not again be mine. That's the stuff, exclaimed Rivet, fired up by the rhythm. Rosa continued, What, Grandma, you weren't always a saint? Heh, why, I knew in dreams of night, at 15 years, without constraint. The refrain was bellowed by everyone in unison, with Rivet stamping his foot on the shaft and beating time on the white horse's back with the reins. The animal, as if also infected by the lively rhythm, suddenly broke into a gallop, a furious gallop, like a whirlwind, so that the ladies in the cart tumbled into a heap on top of one another. They picked themselves up, laughing like madwomen, and the song, shouted at the top of their lungs under the blazing sky, continued to ring out over the fields, amidst the ripening grain, to the frantic gallop of the horse. With every repetition of the refrain, the horse would take the bit between its teeth and dash off another 100 meters at a gallop, to the immense delight of the passengers. From time to time, a road-mender breaking stones would straighten up and, peering through his wire mask, watch in astonishment as this madcap wagon flew past, roaring in a cloud of dust. When they alighted at the station, the carpenter grew sentimental. What a pity you're leaving. We could have had such a good time. The madam replied with restrained good sense. Everything in its time. One can't be merry forever. Then a brilliant idea struck Rivet. "I say," he exclaimed, "I'll come and visit you in Fécamp next month." He shot a sly, gleaming glance at Rosa. "Very well," concluded the madam, "but be sensible. Come if you wish, but no foolishness." He made no reply, and as soon as the train whistle sounded, he began saying his goodbyes and kissing everyone. When it was Rosa's turn, he was seized by a stubborn desire to kiss her on the mouth, but she laughed, keeping her lips pressed together, and with a deft movement of her head, evaded him each time. He held her in his embrace, but achieved nothing, hindered by the long whip he still held in his hand, which waved desperately behind the girl's back. "Passengers for Rouen, all aboard," shouted the guard, and they all took their seats. A whistle blew, immediately followed by the locomotive's powerful blast. It noisily expelled its first jet of steam, and the wheels began to turn, slowly and with effort. Rivet ran from the station to the level crossing gate to see Rosa one more time. And as the carriage full of that lively, merry cargo passed by, he began to crack his whip, jump up and down, and sing at the top of his voice. "My shapely leg I mourn, my hand so soft and fine. I mourn the days long gone, that will not again be mine." And he saw a white handkerchief wave from the window, growing smaller in the distance. They slept the entire journey with the peaceful slumber of a satisfied conscience, and when they returned home, refreshed, rested, and ready to resume their nightly labors, the madam could not help but remark, "Say what you will, but I'd already started to miss the place." They ate a hasty supper, changed into their familiar battle dress, and settled in to await their regular clients. The lit lantern, the one by the Madonna, announced to passers-by that the flock had returned to the fold. The news spread instantly, no one knew how or by whom. Monsieur Philippe, the banker's son, was so obliging as to send a special messenger to inform Monsieur Tourneveau, who was imprisoned within the bosom of his family. The fish curer had relatives over for dinner every Sunday. They were drinking coffee when a man suddenly appeared with a letter. Monsieur Tourneveau, visibly agitated, opened the envelope and turned pale. The note, written in pencil, contained only a few words. "The consignment of cod has been found. The ship has entered port. It's a profitable affair. Come at once." He fumbled in his pockets, gave the messenger 2 sous, and, flushing to the tips of his ears, announced, "I must go out on urgent business." Handing his wife the brief and mysterious note, he rang the bell and said to the maid who entered, "My coat, quick, quick, and my hat." Once in the street, he broke into a run, whistling a tune, and the road seemed to him twice as long as usual, so great was his impatience. The Tellier establishment had a festive air. On the ground floor, the dock workers were making a deafening racket, their voices thundering. Louise and Flora, not knowing whom to serve next, drank with first one, then another, living up to their nickname, the 2 Pumps, more than ever. They were called from all sides, could barely keep up with the demand, and the night promised to be exceptionally busy. Upstairs, the company had gathered by 9 o'clock. Monsieur Vasse, the judge of the commercial court and the madam's acknowledged, albeit platonic, admirer, was chatting quietly with her in a corner. They were smiling at each other as if on the verge of reaching some kind of agreement. Monsieur Poulin, the former mayor, had seated Rosa on his knees, and she was stroking his gray side whiskers with her short hands. From beneath her hitched-up yellow silk skirt, a part of her bare thigh was visible, standing out sharply against the black cloth of his trousers. Her red stockings were held up by the blue garters, the commercial traveler's gift. The tall Fernandez was stretched out on the sofa, her feet resting on the stomach of Monsieur Pimpus, the tax collector, while her bosom was pressed against the waistcoat of young Monsieur Philippe, her right arm around his neck, a cigarette held in her left hand. Raphael seemed to be conducting negotiations with Monsieur Dupuis, the insurance agent, and concluded them by saying, "Very well, my dear, tonight I am agreeable." Then, executing a rapid, waltzing turn about the room, she cried, "Tonight, anything you wish." At that moment, the door flew open, and Monsieur Tourneveau appeared. A chorus of joyful shouts went up. "Long live Tourneveau!" Raphael, still spinning, fell against his chest. Without a word, he seized her in his powerful embrace, lifted her as if she were a feather, crossed the room, reached the door at the far end, and, to thunderous applause, disappeared with her up the staircase leading to the bedrooms. Rosa, who had been exciting the former mayor, continuously kissing him and holding his head by the side whiskers to keep it upright, decided to follow this example. "Come on, let's go too," she said. The old gentleman got up, straightened his waistcoat, and followed the girl, fumbling in his pocket for money. Only Fernande and the madame now remained with the four other men, and Monsieur Philippe exclaimed, "I'll stand champagne." Madame Tellier sent for 3 bottles, and Fernande, hugging him, whispered, "Play for us to dance, will you?" He rose and sat down at the old piano, slumbering in the corner, extracting from its groaning interior a wheezy, plaintive waltz. The tall girl wrapped her arms around the tax collector. The madame surrendered to the embrace of Monsieur Vasse, and the two couples began to whirl, exchanging kisses as they danced. Monsieur Vasse, who had once danced in society, struck graceful poses, and the madame looked at him with a gaze of admiration. That gaze which says yes, a more intimate and sweet yes than any spoken word. Frederick brought the champagne. The first cork popped, and Monsieur Philippe struck up the introduction to a quadrille. The 4 dancers performed it in a genteel fashion, properly, decorously, ceremoniously, with curtsies and bows. After that, they attacked the champagne. Just then, Monsieur Tourneveau reappeared, satisfied, relieved, and beaming. He exclaimed, "I don't know what's come over Raphael tonight, but she is perfection itself." A glass was handed to him, and he drained it in one go, muttering, "Damn it, what luxury!" Immediately, Monsieur Philippe struck up a lively polka, and Monsieur Tourneveau started to dance with the beautiful Jewess, lifting her right off the floor so that her feet didn't touch it. Monsieur Pimpus and Monsieur Vasse set off after them with renewed vigor. From time to time, one of the couples would stop by the fireplace to down a glass of the sparkling liquid. The dance threatened to go on forever, when suddenly Rosa opened the door a crack, holding a candlestick. Her hair was loose. She was in slippers and nothing but her chemise, looking flushed and animated. "I want to dance," she cried. "What about your old man?" asked Raphael. Rosa burst out laughing. "Him? He's asleep already. He falls asleep the moment he's done." She grabbed Monsieur Dupuis, who had been sitting idle on the sofa, and the polka started up again. Meanwhile, the bottles were emptied. "I'll stand another one," proclaimed Monsieur Tourneveau. "So will I," announced Monsieur Vasse. "And I," concluded Monsieur Dupuis. Everyone applauded. Everything was going splendidly, and the evening was turning into a genuine ball. From time to time, even Louise and Flora would run up from downstairs and hastily dance a turn of a waltz while their clients downstairs grew impatient. Then they would dash back to the café, their hearts filled with vexation. By midnight, the dancing was still in full swing. Every now and then, one of the girls would disappear, and when she was sought after, needed for a quadrille, it was suddenly noticed that one of the gentlemen was missing too. "Where have you been?" Monsieur Philippe asked jokingly, just as Monsieur Pimpus returned to the salon with Fernande. "We went to see how Monsieur Poulin is sleeping," the tax collector replied. This witty remark was a huge success, and henceforth, to see how Monsieur Poulin is sleeping, everyone took turns going upstairs with one or another of the girls, who were exceptionally accommodating that night. The madam turned a blind eye and conducted lengthy, separate conversations with Monsieur Vasse in various corners, as if to settle the final details of an agreement already concluded. Finally, at 1 o'clock in the morning, the married men, Monsieur Tourneveau and Monsieur Pimpus, declared they must leave and asked for their bills. They were charged only for the champagne, and even that at 6 francs a bottle instead of the usual 10. And to their astonishment at such generosity, the beaming madam replied, "One doesn't have a celebration every day,